Welcome back to Nuclear Energy TV from our studios here near Washington, D.C. as we go into the afternoon of New Nuclear Capital event here near Washington, D.C. And we're going to go through a few housekeeping items first. There is a tech support link above the player. If you have any questions and tech support, need any tech support, just hit that and our tech support team will come back. There is a questions link to email your questions in right below that. Please email your questions as soon as you have them so we don't get them in time we do get them in time for the end of the session. Finally, the archives for these videos will be up within 24 to 48 hours after the end of the New Nuclear Capital event. With that, I'll now turn it over to Bud Albright. Bud?
Thanks, Dave, and welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the morning session. I thought that last panel certainly got to, well, what do we need to do? What do we need to be focused on? What are the guys with the hands on the money thinking about? I think that is that's what we're here for. I want to welcome Patty Ailing to give us a presentation here. And Patty I want to welcome him and as well welcome Moltex, that is one of our newest members for the USNIC. We welcome you. Patty spent the last, I think it's 18 months, Patty, in Uganda. And before that, he was there advising as a CFO, advising numerous companies, I believe. And then several years he was with now I'm blowing my intro here, Deloitte, with Deloitte in London. And while he was there, he worked closely with Moltex. And obviously they got to know each other, and I think they must have seen a good man. They grabbed him and pulled him inside. So he's going to talk to us about what I think is, if not unique, certainly interestingly fairly singular, but a financing method that has been used by Moltex. So, Patty, turn it over to you before I completely botch your presentation.
Thanks very much, Bud. Thank you for the introduction. And as you say, we're a new member for NIC, and I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to be here and to speak to everyone. So thanks again. I've got a slide deck which I will put up now. So I'm here to talk about Moltex's experience with crowdfunding, which, as Bud says, is pretty unique in our industry. We completed a round back in 2019, which I'll give some detail on. I'm going to first talk about a bit of an introduction to Moltex, who we are, what we do, what we represent, before going on to the crowdfunding details, a bit of information around the process and what people might look out for if they choose to follow that path. And then I think just the general funding situation with us and with our industry, being the SMR industry. I think the previous session really had a lot of important points on the head, so I'll look to cover a few of those. And then hopefully we can cover more of those in the Q&A, for which I've allowed 5 minutes at the end of the presentation. So, Moltex Energy, who are we? For those of you who don't know us, we are originally a UK company, founded in 2014 by our founder and the inventor of our key patents, Dr. Ian Scott, who remains with the company. We're a reactor designer and IP company, so our aspiration is to develop technology for our customers to build and operate. And our overall strategy is to displace fossil fuels by price alone. So we want to make nuclear power the most economical choice, thereby not relying on subsidies. We moved into Canada for a chunk of our business, which I'll cover on the next slide, in 2018. And we're one of 4 reactor vendors that Canada plans to build over the next 10, 15 years. We are situated in Canada in New Brunswick in the Atlantic province. And we were down selected by New Brunswick Power from a short list of a long list of over 90 reactor vendors 3 years ago. So we're very proud to be there and working with them. A quick minute on our technologies. We count 4 technologies within our portfolio. What we believe really sets us apart at Moltex is our attitude to waste and what we can do with waste. I'll touch on some of the numbers briefly in a second, but we have a waste recycling process that we call WATS in the second bubble there. Waste to stable salts is what that stands for. And with this process, we can convert the existing spent nuclear fuel, specifically in the first instance, the CANDU fuel in Canada, into the fuel for our reactor. So our reactor is a waste burning reactor that we call the SSRW, the stable salt reactor waste burner. Both of those technologies are owned and being developed by our company in North America, Moltex Energy North America. Additionally, in the UK over here, we do have a uranium fueled reactor, which uses the same core technology processes. So it's also a stable salt reactor. Both of them are molten salt reactors. And lastly, we make use of an existing technology from the solar industry that we call grid reserve, which I think is a crucial addition to our portfolio and our offering to our customers, because we will be able to offer a peaking facility, which as we move forward to net zero with fluctuating renewables, everyone knows is very important. And all these technologies are underpinned with a strong family of patents and other associated IP. Quickly on our business plan then, in the first instance, our business plan on waste recycling, and in the second instance on the SMR, the reactor itself. And the waste recycling, firstly, we aim to have our first WATS plant, which you can see a graphic of it on the right-hand side, operational by about 2030. The WATS business, or the waste recycling business, will have 2 real revenue streams. One, firstly, sort of attacks the existing waste liabilities, which are extremely significant in every civil nuclear nation. And the second revenue stream is the sale of the ready-made fuel to the waste-burning reactor, or potentially other plutonium-burning reactors around the world. To put some colour on the first of those, the existing budget in Canada for waste disposition into what is called the Deep Geological Repository is 26 billion Canadian dollars, or 20 billion US. So our aim as a company is to go after a substantial part of that liability. We believe we can save up to 50% or more of that, which is clearly a huge figure. To extrapolate that globally, everyone's probably familiar, but in the US, the existing liability as we talk is around 50 billion US. And at the end of the fleet of current Gen 3 reactors globally, that's expected to be about 400 billion US. So there's a huge market there, and we think we're unique in going after this in the first instance. We hope it can be a significant part of our offering financially. On the reactor front, we aim to have our first operational plant, for which we have an agreement signed with New Brunswick Power in the early 2030s. That will be a 300 megawatt SSRW, our reactor type, and will be fueled entirely, exclusively by existing spent fuel at New Brunswick Power's current nuclear power station at Point Lepreau, which is quite a unique offering. In terms of the Canadian fleet, which is our business plan beyond that, we've calculated that the fuel across Canada, largely in Ontario, would be enough to fuel around 5.5 gigawatts of our reactors. So that sort of illustrates the size of electricity generation you can create from the existing waste. A few of the earlier panelists mentioned the problems, if only politically or socially, with fuel supply. And so hopefully we've killed 2 birds with 1 stone there. Lastly, on the reactor side, in terms of the export potential in the market, if you take those figures globally, we're looking at gigawatts in the region of 80 to 120 of possible waste-burning reactors, and that excludes the spent fuel in Russia and China. So suffice it to say, there's a huge opportunity here for us and for all of our allies in North America to develop waste-burning technology. So we've introduced ourselves. Now onto the crowdfunding campaign. So we found ourselves in the second half of 2019 with a lot of positive momentum. We had recently received a grant from New Brunswick Power, and we were ready to engage with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the CNSC, and their vendor design review phase 1, which is an optional pre-licensing process that you can go through. We thought sensible for a novel reactor design. So we needed to raise the money to match New Brunswick Power's grant. We hired a professional advisor to help us develop our materials, and we were fortunate enough to find a strategic lead investor, which was a Spanish engineering company called IDOM, and they are one of our investors now. What we then realized, a colleague of mine was very smart to take a look at our mailing list. We had roughly 1,000 back then, pretty passionate supporters. And what we find is the sort of people who like to follow our company are exactly that. They're very passionate. So if you sort of translate that into the financing universe, what you essentially conclude is that maybe a crowdfunding raise is actually your best way of finding the funds that you need. So we got in touch with a crowdfunding platform here in the UK called Shadow Founder, as you can see down there. They had some relevant experience, but as I said, this was completely unprecedented for the nuclear industry. So we were both sort of feeling in the dark a little bit. Despite that fact, both sides were keen, and our posting went live in Q3 of 2019. So a little bit more about the process. If you want to go through a crowdfunding campaign, these are the rough steps that you'll want to follow. So we appointed what we deemed a suitable crowdfunding platform. We prepared the sales documents, the teaser, the IM, the model to back that up, etc., using another advisor and also the crowdfunding platform's assistance as well. You will need to identify your lead investor and, in fact, your crowd as well. So you'd want to bring that to the table, preferably. And I'll talk about the sort of snowballing effect that comes from starting off with an existing base. Number 4, the crowdfunder, they're all registered over here with the equivalent of the SEC, which is called the FCA. They will need to do their own due diligence, so you need to allow some time for that. And then you're setting your target and posting your opportunity on the page. Ours, on the right-hand side, you can see what it looked like on their website. Following that, there's a reasonable amount of investor events, marketing, sales and marketing, etc., that you would expect in this sort of process. And if you've seen the emails that came from USNIC prior to this event, you'll know that the raised figure there of 4.5 actually ended up being 5 million. So given the stage of company we were at in 2019, this was a really good result. And ultimately, it meant we were able to use the money from New Brunswick Power, and we started our VDR phase 1 process on time, which we've since completed. So looking at the pros and cons of a crowdfunding process or campaign, unsurprisingly, the pros outweigh the cons as far as we're concerned here. The crowdfunding platform has the option to group all of your investors into one shareholder for the company. So as far as interactions and paperwork, your shareholder relations or IR and paperwork are concerned, which is quite a big deal for a startup, which we certainly were then. You know, we were only 5 or 10 people. That's a big bonus. That you'll find that their reach is significant. Especially if you're doing it in an industry that's familiar to crowdfunding. Not necessarily the case with us, but we still found that the snowball effect, which is the latter bullet there on interest generates interest, really helped us to find a new investor base that we didn't have before. The third bullet there is a really important point. So if you're able to bring a lead investor to the table, as we were able to do with IDOM, your smaller investors, which were largely high net worth individuals, they take a huge amount of reliance on the due diligence of not just the lead investor, but also the crowdfunding platform itself. As I said, they're obliged to do that DD through their registration with the FCA. And lastly, there a point which I'm not sure if it's specific to the UK, whether it also applies in the States, but we have a scheme called EIS where individuals can take advantage of tax benefits for venture investments. And our crowdfunding raise was eligible for investors for that reason. So that was obviously a key benefit for them. In terms of some points to watch out for, your fees are probably marginally higher than you'd be looking at for a traditional raise. You're probably looking at 6-7% plus. Your documents will still need to be prepared by the company. They're not looked after entirely by the crowdfunding platform. So you may still require an advisor, depending on your in-house competence. And that will, of course, increase your fees further a little bit. And the last point is sort of the negative element of the first pro under the green plus sign, which is that because the crowdfunding platform is really looking after all the paperwork, there is a little bit of a lack of transparency over some of the processes and transactions. So you need to make sure that you manage them appropriately to keep an eye on that. So post crowdfunding campaign, where does that leave us as a company in the first instance? And then I'll talk a little bit about my views on the industry, which have again been addressed in the previous panel, and some really important points raised. Unsurprisingly, as fantastic as it was then, £5 million or $6.5 million doesn't fund an entire design and licensing process for a novel reactor. We were able to secure over 50 million Canadian dollar funding from the federal government earlier this year, in addition to around 7 million US that we've secured from the Department of Energy across 2 projects in the last few years. And we've got further investment from multiple other sources. One point that I don't think was raised in the previous paneling session, so to try and bring the SMR point of view into the conversation here, is that for most of these, especially the federal government sources, and I think especially in Canada, you will need match funding to extract these. So if you look at the overall timeframe for development and licensing of an SMR company, you will always need a substantial amount of private equity. So that needs to come from somewhere. As the last point is really to say that as we move along the development timetable, those sums that you require are going to be ever larger. We forecast in Moltex that we'll need around 300 million US to fund the complete development of our technologies before we believe they can be project financed. So from the look on us individually as a company, where do we see the sort of funding landscape for the SMR industry? Everyone knows nuclear has traditionally been funded almost exclusively by governments all around the world. Thankfully, everyone on this call knows that net zero needs nuclear, and increasingly people are finally accepting that nuclear needs SMRs. There was a sheet that was shown earlier that spoke about the amount raised in the SMR industry, although it did also include fusion over the last year or two. And that was already in the billions. So if you extrapolate that forward, the next 5, 10, 15 years that various vendors will need for their commercialization timeframe, it's obviously going to be billions, probably tens of billions more over that period. And as I say, as much as some of that can come from governments, a lot of it will need to be matched and therefore come from the private sector. On which note, until very recently, which we'll touch on in a second, the private markets have seemed pretty reluctant overall to step in our field, normally citing long commercialization timeframes, technology risk, potentially political risk in some arenas as well. But I do think the landscape is shifting, and a couple of the people earlier mentioned various elements of this. I think events such as COP26, as much as they seem sort of headline grabbing for the main part, they have really helped to increase the momentum. And on the next point, we've recently seen in the UK an announcement on Rolls-Royce, who have raised funding totaling around £500 million, and several other companies in the States and Canada. And what that really demonstrates is that with the right balance of government commitment and a security that the government commitment won't just evaporate if the government changes, which I think is very important. Someone mentioned cross-party support in the US earlier, as well as significant industry support, whether that's from a utility or an EPC company or some other industry body. Funding an SMR project is now very much, it looks very much possible. What I'm interested in is how soon will there be more nuclear-focused funds like Valerie's Nucleation? I think if you look at our case study of the crowdfunding, we can't do 6 million rounds every month or so for the next 10 years. But if you extrapolate that to the scale we all need, then what you're looking at really is a VC industry. So contrary to what one of the panelists said earlier, I do think there's appetite for that. If you think about the people behind the VC funds who are coming up, they're younger people who have, someone I think said, less dogmatic view of how things should be funded, and there's more patience. And I think my overwhelming view is that, as we've seen in numerous other industries, there's an ability to put up patient capital that can wait 10, 15 years for a much bigger carrot at the end of the road. And I really don't see why nuclear SMRs are any different to that. So we have a view that those funds will hopefully proliferate and spread their risk across the industry, allowing true sort of competitive spirit to be fostered. In addition to that, not listed on the points, but someone also mentioned earlier the SPAC universe, and we've examined this quite closely as a company this year. Whether it's at this stage of development or at some point in the next few years, I think there's a clear appetite there, given the ESG banner above so many of the recent SPACs, for significant funds to be raised for our industry. So that's certainly an interesting avenue. So just to bring the presentation to a close ahead of Q&As, I think my key points would be, we all know probably in this forum, but thankfully beyond this forum, it's starting to become accepted, or to be accepted, that nuclear is more central than ever to our decarbonisation plans. And I think we would all agree this can only increase in the coming years as people understand the more technical side of the industry. The middle point there, I think the headwinds we've seen in the past on financing of new nuclear projects should hopefully ease. As governments, there's a huge amount more pressure on governments to take more direct action, whether that's through grants, whether it's through underwriting cost overruns, whether it's through signing PPAs. We're seeing that activity really increasing in a positive way at the moment globally. And then lastly, the subject matter of the presentation on crowdfunding, that was certainly an innovative financing initiative, and that's what we try to bring to the table at Moltex. As I said, for the early stage of SMR companies, it can certainly help to bridge a difficult period ahead of a bigger funding round. And hopefully, as I said, if you extrapolate crowdfunding, we'll see some really nuclear-focused funds in the not-too-distant future that can fund companies like ours through to the project finance stage. So with that, I will bring it to the Q&A section.
Thanks, Patty. Unfortunately, I think we're out of time. We started a little late, but I would ask this question for people who have questions, and are you available? I know you have a day job. Are you available to talk with people if they may have some general questions about crowdfunding?
Yes, of course, please. I can share screen again, or I guess if people can get in touch with the event organisers, my details are with them. I'm more than happy to help people.
Great. And I apologize, I thought I had my video on. Patty, thank you so much. And we're going to move to our next panel. We appreciate it. And we welcome you again as I think, newest member of USNIC family.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bob. We're happy to be here. So hopefully lots more of these to come.
Thanks.